Good morning subscribers, welcome back. So now we're going to have a look at the protectionist policies that can be used in order to potentially rectify and maybe start to recover and repair a current account deficit. So I'm only going to consider the recommended suggestions which are in your textbook really. So we've covered in the previous video, we've covered these two bullet points. Now I want to look at this third one. So here we have a tariff, which is a tax on a good as it crosses a national boundary. A quota, which is a physical limit on the amount of goods. An embargo, which is a total ban. And regulation. So regulation can be things to do with what happens to goods when they reach a port and how difficult or easy you make it for those goods to go through the customs whenever they arrive. So these are the various methods cited in your textbook. So let's have a look at a few of them and the associated diagrams, ladies and gentlemen. So here we go. So I'm going to consider these three diagrams: one for tariff, one for quota, one for subsidy, and then we'll maybe talk a little bit about evaluation of each of these when we get to that point. So let's start with a tariff. So as I was explaining to my students earlier this week, you've actually already sort of done a tariff diagram, I'm sure, if you have considered the whole notion of a tax and the impact of a tax on supply. Because what does a tax do? It raises costs of production, supply curve shifts upwards or to the left, and as a consequence of that there is a contraction of demand, and so price rises, demand contracts, and that's really what a tariff is intended to do. So the actual tariff diagram is really just the same as your tax diagram. So let's draw that now. So we've got our normal demand curve like so, we've got our supply curve, and of course the point at which they intersect is the equilibrium, P1 and Q1. As I explained, a tax increases costs of production, so the supply curve shifts upwards and to the left, as you know. So we go to S2, and hence we have a new equilibrium which is formed here at this pen is dreadful, ladies and gentlemen. We have a new equilibrium formed here at P2 and Q2. And so you can see, exactly as I've explained there, we have had a contraction of demand, so moving up the demand curve, prices increase, quantity demanded falls. So if you apply that to imports, the demand for imports ought to fall. So that's the tariff diagram. What about the quota? So the quota is a physical limit, actually physically limiting the number. So you'll know that if you've looked at, say, common agricultural policy and fisheries policies and quotas and the amount of fish that can be caught. So let's draw our quota diagram. Again, very straightforward diagrams really. Supply and demand once again. Initial equilibrium, same thing. So the slight difference in this case is we're going to say, okay, we're limiting it to a specific amount. So let's just say that the amount happened to be, I don't know, 50 washing machines, whatever it might be. So as a consequence of that, the supply becomes perfectly inelastic at that point, like so. And again, the impact on price is really the same as for tariff. It's just another method of doing it, because here's our new equilibrium here, where the new supply curve intersects the demand curve, and again the price is here, P2, at quantity of 50, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for this pen, it's terrible. So as a consequence, once again, price has increased, quantity demanded has contracted. Okay, so let's take a look at both of these because they're really tackling the price of imports, whereas the subsidy is more looking at the price of exports. So let's look at these in more detail. Can we say anything in evaluation about the success or unsuccessfulness of these policies? Well, I think the first thing to mention, that you must mention if you get a question about this, is that if you impose a tariff on other countries' goods, what is to prevent them from imposing a tariff on your goods? And the same goes for quotas. So one of the problems is that you can find that there will be You'll find, ladies and gentlemen, that there will be retaliation. I do apologise, ladies and gentlemen, for this board work, because this board is dreadful. See if we can get this rubbed out. Let's see if I can... No, still nothing. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'll just talk about this because this is taking too much time. So retaliation is a problem. Any other problems? Yes, of course there are. Well, particularly with the tariff diagram. What if the goods which you are importing are very price inelastic in demand? So in other words, rather than having this rather shallow curve, what if it was very, very steep? Well, if it was very steep, that would mean that you would have to impose a very, very significant tariff or tax in order to reduce quantity demanded by anything like this type of distance. So price elasticity of demand is a very important evaluative statement when you're talking about the tariff. What about the quotas? Well, the same thing can apply. If you impose a quota on one country's goods, the country may choose in turn to reciprocate and impose a quota on your goods. So again, that is something which may arise. And as was discussed by some of my students the other day, what's to stop the emergence of a black market in certain goods, the law of unintended consequences in that respect? So you impose a quota and a physical limit is put in place, but then there are other markets in which goods and services come into your economy via the black market. So that can be a bit of an issue as well. Okay, let's now tackle, ladies and gentlemen, the final diagram, which is our subsidy diagram. Let's see if we can actually get something working on the board here with regard to subsidy. Okay, so S1, D1, start equilibrium, P1, and Q1. Now what does a subsidy do? Well, a subsidy is really looking at the other side of the coin. Rather than restricting imports, it's saying, let's make our exports more competitive. So if you introduce a subsidy, costs of production don't rise, they fall. So rather than supply shifting left and up, supply shifts right and downwards. So we draw our new subsidy supply curve on here, like so. So we go in S1 to S2, ladies and gentlemen. Price falls to P2, quantity rises to Q2. So the whole notion here is that your price, your export prices become more competitive, and as a consequence, you're able to sell more exports. Okay, that's the general premise. Therefore, you sell more exports and your current account should improve. The trade balance should move more towards surplus. What about this sort of policy? Well, of course, with any subsidy, there is an opportunity cost element. So if you choose to subsidise exports, you can't subsidise health, education, that type of thing. There's the whole notion of the elasticity of demand. No point really subsidising a good for which demand is very inelastic, price inelastic, because you'll not really see that much of an expansion or an extension of demand. So if this curve, the demand curve, is very steep, despite the fact that you could have an enormous subsidy, you wouldn't really see that much increase in overall demand. There's the problem that if you subsidise one sector, then your competitors in other countries will subsidise that sector also. There's the whole notion of what size should the particular subsidy be, and of course you could apply that to the tax for a tariff as well. What's the appropriate level? So there are all sorts of evaluative comments that you could use. And if you look at the specification, it talks in there. The bullet point, the final bullet point, talks about evaluating methods which can be used to cure a current account deficit. So asking you to talk about these policies, but then also to provide some evaluation statements at the end. So in my next video, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to show you one or two exemplar scripts which you can get from me, hello@geekonomics.co.uk. And it's just previous year's work where the specific question was about tariffs, I believe, and that might help you in your preparation for this exam. So apologies for the board, ladies and gents, it's very annoying.